Thank you for this kind invitation to Center for Critical Studies and to War Naufal who invited me. So I take this as an opportunity to think about something new that I'm kind of currently thinking about. So what I'm kind of going to do is shift the focus a little bit from Islamic studies and thinking about Islamic studies to thinking about sociological or anthropological studies of Islam. So, the key focus for my talk and my own research is understanding how human beings are engaging with things. These human beings will be, in this case, not only the laymen but also religious scholars. So that is the kind of the central ground from which I'm kind of beginning this. I might have to come back to this, responding to some of your questions. That's why I'm just putting that ground. So this paper is titled Islam as a Lived Tradition. Okay? So this is something that I'm kind of thinking, now. So I'll read most of this. So this has 4 sections. So my disquiet with existing sociological and anthropological conceptualization of Islam began when I became engrossed with my work on caste among Muslims. While caste is said to be the quintessential social structure of Hinduism in India, many scholars have noted that it structures Muslim social relations too. Yet, I met with a range of responses from my interlocutors, including agreement, confusion, dismissal, to willful resistance in using the category of caste to designate Muslim social hierarchy in India. Some asserted that there is no caste in Islam. They reasoned that caste is a hierarchical structure specific to Hinduism and it should not be used to denote social hierarchy among Muslims. Others saw the existence of caste-like practices among Muslims and attributed its persistence to Muslims' incapacity to learn and practice correct tenets of Islam. They held the religious scholars as responsible for its enduring existence among Muslims. Still, others dismissed the existence of hierarchy altogether among, among Muslims, claiming that everyone is equal in front of Allah and there is no question of distinction among Muslims. There were also a few who called upon the state to end or ameliorate caste discrimination and difference among Muslims. All these claims were sincere and forceful. Sometimes my interlocutors found refuge in Quranic verses to the effect that everyone is equal in front of Allah and social distinctions do not matter in Islam. What matters is one's piety. I'm sure you know all these verses. Others found various ideas and norms in Islamic jurisprudence that supported hierarchical divisions. I also encountered historical rationalizations to the effect that since all Muslims are converts from various Hindu castes, they have still retained the caste mentality and reconstructed hierarchical practices in newer ways. I have been wondering as to how one can understand the multiple ways in which Muslims are engaging with caste and how do we conceptualize the variegated Muslim subjectivity which are kind of being assumed in all these positions. The idea of caste itself is very complex. It has been defined in numerous ways owing to its origin, influence, and modality of working across South Asia. Whatever definition we subscribe to, there have been key features that have been enumerated as its defining criteria. Caste is based on one's birth into a social group. Caste is endogamous. Caste is hierarchical. Caste defines one's occupation, particularly in the case of lower classes. If you observe Muslims across South Asia, you can see that they too hold on to these beliefs and practices. In short, they can be said to follow caste-like practices. Yet, if we go a bit deeper, inquiring what are the ideas underlying these practices, we get a totally different picture. For instance, rather than foregrounding ritual purity and hierarchical difference, Muslims may cite ideas like kufu or kafa, whatever you, to ascertain and justify the practice of endogamy. Kufu is a jurisprudential category in Islam which can be roughly translated as marital compatibility. The whole point is that there is a system of values underlying hierarchical practices among Muslims that justify and rationalize social divisions and attendant practices. At the same time, why do they persist in practicing them if they are antithetical to the Quranic spirit of egalitarianism? To answer, so the other question one can ask is caste an Islamic practice? To answer these questions, I suggest that we must think about the ideas of Muslim subjectivity and social context a little harder and deeper. One of the responses to such questions usually dismisses this narrative by arguing that there will always be disjunctions between text and practice, and such practices will be superseded as Muslims gain correct and fuller meanings of the teachings of Islam. This is from Francis Robinson. This solution seems untenable for the simple fact that Islam has come to a place like Malabar in South India at the time of Prophet Muhammad himself, and caste practices still exist. That is, even after 1400 years. So, it could either be that Islam has been unable to empower Muslims to discard caste, or it could be that there is something else that is happening in Muslim societies that sustains the perpetuation of caste-like practices which our theoretical models have been unable to capture. Now I move to the second section. Scholars have sought to understand Islam using various sorts of frames. They include great, little, text, practice, traditional, reformist, global, local, ethical, everyday, which are all shaped by various social, economic, and political impulses. In employing such frames as great, little, and global and local, there is always a lopsidedness at play. The latter category in these binaries always represent the popular, not fully Islamic tendencies, while the former represents the authentic, pure versions of Islam. These divisions are sometimes also historicized and geographically mapped to mean that the authentic, pure versions emerged at the center at a particular time in Arabia, and the adulterated versions were produced in the peripheries by various methods of cultural translations. Yet, such conceptualizations do not do justice to the simultaneous dissemination of Islam in many parts of the world, as well as the sheer number of Muslims and their life world in these so-called peripheries. Categories such as traditional, reformist, and text and practice became key to thinking about Muslim lives, particularly after the 19th century. This discourse was also implicated in the colonial production of knowledge, where ideas like rationality, superstition, and ignorance were used to characterize and think about the colonized population and their religious beliefs. In Muslim societies too, such categories became part of the repertoire to make sense of and think about both the political and religious predicament and future. Many Muslim scholars and political thinkers in North India tried to comprehend the loss of Muslim political power and authority using these terms. It was proposed that Muslims lost political power because they had deviated from correct tenets and ways of being a Muslim, and they needed to introspect and reform their religious lives. The traditional was often defined as ignorant, syncretic, and superstitious, against which the reformist was characterized as textual, intellectual, and rationalist. The reformist tendencies aimed to purify Muslim life of any accretions from the local environment. The traditionalist groups were accused of being backward, syncretic, and therefore not fully Islamic. The persistence of caste, for example, if you are kind of following this frame, could be located as an exemplification of the syncretic nature of Islam in India, and the traditional ulama could be caricatured as being responsible for not eradicating such non-Islamic elements from Muslim social life. This is one kind of an interpretation we can give. In recent times, the idea of studying Islam has been located within the frames of ethical and everyday. The idea of ethical rose from Asad's idea of discursive tradition. In a much cited article, I'm sure you are all familiar with this. The idea of an anthropology of Islam, Talal Asad posited that Islam should be understood as a discursive tradition, meaning, I quote, a tradition of Muslim discourses that addresses itself to conceptions of the Islamic past and future with a reference to a particular practice in the present, unquote. I want to pick two key elements from this conceptualization, practice and present. About practice, Asad has this to say. The proper theoretical beginning for an anthropology of Islam is, I quote, instituted practice, set in a particular context and having a particular history into which Muslims are inducted as Muslims, unquote. The practice becomes Islamic and the doers become Muslims because, I quote again, it is authorized by the discursive tradition of Islam and is taught to Muslims as such, unquote. The problem with this position is that often the point of conflict and debate among Muslims is not simply about the proper conduct of practices, but also the legitimacy of certain practices and whether they can be deemed Islamic by any means. It is true that Asad recognizes power as an important element in designating the truth of a practice and its claim to being Islamic. Yet, the idea of power is a very complex affair in societies like India, where Muslims are a minority, and often the state meddles in deciding whether a practice is truly Islamic through secular judicial processes. My point is that practice in itself cannot be the theoretical starting point for an anthropology of Islam. Now, let us look at how Asad conceives of the present. In the beginning of the same article, he asserts the following, I quote, this is a long quote. Narratives about culturally distinctive actors must try to translate and represent the historically situated discourses of such actors as responses to the discourses of others, instead of schematizing and dehistoricizing their actions, unquote. This suggestion to closely attend to the context of the actors is a valid one for any anthropological project and is repeated a few times in different ways. He goes on to say even that, I quote, it is clear that there has never been any Muslim society in which the religious law of Islam has governed more than a fragment of their social life, unquote. It is implied that Muslim lives are complex and Muslims are not motivated and regulated by normative Islam alone. As he proceeds to conceptualize discursive tradition, this capacious idea of the context becomes limited and narrow. It becomes about how orthodoxy defines certain practices as Islamic. As a response to this narrow view of understanding Islam, many scholars have foregrounded the idea of everyday Islam to understand the complexities of Muslim subjectivity today. So I'm sure you are also kind of familiar with these scholars, Schilke, Debevec, Magnus Marsden, Andrew Birchok. The main proposition has been that we must look, I quote, at the way people live lives of which religious beliefs and practices constitutes a part, unquote, and seek to understand how religion helps them navigate a course of life. This is from Schilke and Debevec. Muslims are not always successful or aiming at a doctrinal adherence or to embody the prescriptive registers in their all actions. Their actions are often shot through ambivalence, confusion, and dilemma. My approach is closely aligned with such a proposition, and I hope to extend such a framework to think about the idea of Muslim subject and social context so that we are able to conceptualize the modes of relating to Islam today. The idea of the everyday has been figured in South Asian anthropology as lived Islam, where the idea of the lived has been used to denote a particular mode of cohabiting with the other. In the Indian context, it has been directly linked to political expediency of living in a majoritarian environment. While scholars like Tahir Jamal, who must be sitting here, has suggested that the emergence of lived Islam as a framework emerged as a particular response to the global security threat thrown upon the Muslims. We can observe that tendencies to frame Muslim lives within the idea of syncretism and coexistence need to be located further back in history to the birth of the post-colonial nation state, or even backwards to the colonial construction of separate electorates to the backward classes and minorities. What is key here is to understand the post-colonial moment, as Muslims who stayed back in India at the time of the partition had to justify their political existence in a majoritarian environment. So, the idea of the lived in South Asian studies has a particular valence for thinking about the other. But what is needed is an analysis of how that Muslims are living their Islam within the broader social, economic, and political context. These binaries have had great theoretical purchase to understand Muslim lives, which I kind of outlined, great, little, traditional, modern, kind of reformist, and all those binaries. Yet there have also been assertions that such binaries, rather than explicating Islam comprehensively, tend to reduce the complexity, fluidity, and flow of Islam. My hope in showing all these propositions is to suggest that there is something fundamentally off about our conceptualization of Islam. We are often unable to locate either the conceptual parameters of Islam anthropologically or sociologically, or distinguish what lies outside its frame. This is not because we do not know what Islam is, or anthropologists are failing to define what Muslims do and see as Islam. Rather, we have often failed to demarcate the domain that lies outside Islam and how to think about Muslim subjectivity in such contexts. Turning to the scholarship on lived religion may give us the required ideas and concepts to think about this predicament. The term lived religion, so I'm coming to the next section. The term lived religion has been coined by David Hall to study American religious life as the everyday doing and thinking by the lay people. This approach was relatively unused so his scholarship came out in 1997. This approach was relatively unused as until then scholars had primarily focused on religious texts, practices, and scholars as the only suitable domain to study religion. From then on, many scholars have employed this perspective and tried to understand religion by focusing on individuals as they enact religion in everyday life. I'm thinking of scholars like Nancy Emmerman, Meredith McGuire, Robert Orsi, Courtney Bender, and all that. Meredith McGuire notes that religion as practiced by individuals are often vastly different from religion as prescribed by institutions and their discourses. Therefore, we need to attend to both how individuals are practicing and embodying religion in everyday life, as well as to how they are relating themselves to and making sense of prescriptive domain of religion. According to Robert Orsi, by employing lived religion as an approach, our aim is, I quote, to develop the practice of disciplined attention to people's signs and practices as they understand, describe, and use them in the context of their experiences, and to the structures and conditions within which these signs and practices emerge, unquote. What is striking about the lived religion approach is how they conceive of the individual. This individual is modern, deeply implicated in projects of modernization, secularization, and globalization. In other words, the subject of lived religion is more complex than the idea of the subject formulated and imagined by doctrinal religions. This is so because, I quote, religious practices are not confined to a single social space, unquote. While it may be useful to think about distinct social domains such as economics, politics, art, and religion, and the cultural logics they sustain, in everyday life, most practices travel across these boundaries. An Indian Muslim, for example, an Indian Muslim in UK may be an immigrant, male, an Asian, and a Muslim all at once. Understanding lived religion mandates attention to such dynamics and the ways in which they take shape in habitual forms of action. At the same time, we should also be attentive to the creativity and agency of people in any social situation. As Anne Studler suggests, habitual patterns take over in settled circumstances where routines are in no doubt. People need to not explain and justify their actions because everyone knows how to do things. When things get unsettled, such as migration, emergence of new discourses, and opening up of new opportunities, people will be working harder to create new patterns and explain them. In short, I quote, patterns of socially constructed action, that is, practices, can be either habitual or creative, depending on the circumstances within which it occurs. The space of lived religion is also the everyday space. This means that, as Amarman puts it, lived religion prioritizes situations and social locations that are not institutionally religious. Against the long standing sociological proposition of delimiting and defining religious phenomena within the bounds of certain hermetic social arenas, such as religious institutions, lived religion foregrounds the domain of the everyday as the site where religion should be analyzed and explicated. Rather than focusing on particular practice, as Courtney Bender has suggested, we should pay attention to practicing religion as a way to dismantle the deep seated notion that religious activity only occurs in designated social religious sphere. This refocus helps us understand what makes certain things and actions religious rather than defining the contours of a self contained religious field. In a sense, all these scholars consider lived as a specific configuration of contemporary life where individuals have a range of competing registers of moral action to choose from and also ways to construct their religiosity. Yet, while such an emphasis was placed on the lived and the individual, scholars have developed this approach in varying ways, often making it difficult to define what constitutes religion in any sense. For instance, some of the characters described by Meredith McGuire are combining Catholicism, Buddhism, and Zen meditation in creative ways to organize their religious lives. While they may claim to belong to either Catholic or Protestant, as the case may be, their lives are not regulated by a rational coherence of a singular doctrine. Rather, as Maguire puts it, their religious lives are modulated by a practical coherence. All the individuals she studies are looking for what works for them in their daily life as a way for living a morally good life. In a sense, the idea of utilitarianism has remained as the kernel of practical coherence underlying the idea of lived tradition. Lived religion is often treated broadly as a concept, as a term, a field of study, as an approach, and sometimes all of these together. As a result, many scholars have urged to define the concept as is used in a particular context. Following this suggestion, I seek to define lived religion within the context of Islam as a lived tradition. So, this is the kind of final section. The idea of the lived and the individual have figured in multifarious ways in anthropological and sociological studies on Muslims across the world, including in Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Finland, Lebanon, in Indonesia, and India, to take few examples. Studying the Shi'i youth and their engagements with leisure in southern Lebanon, Lara Deeb and Mona Harb note that the youth often negotiated with the problem of how to be a Muslim by understanding it to be an individual choice to be made within the competing moral values provided by religion as well as social norms. Issues such as listening to music, drinking, or being near alcohol elicited a range of responses from the youth to the effect that, I quote, practices and discourses of morality are multiple and flexible in their deployments, perhaps especially when it comes to the ideas of leisure, unquote. What emerges ultimately from such individual negotiations is an idea of a Muslim subject who can choose from, I quote again, numerous possibilities for living a good life, pastiches of behavior and ideas that are shaped by the contingencies of the situation, unquote. Similar subjectivities have been delineated in other contexts too. Dorothea Schulz observes that Muslims choose from a range of possibilities for actualizing and embodying faith in urban Mali within the context of changing political climate since the 1991. Many frame their political aspirations as a search for alternative moral codes and as calls for a return to the authentic religious practice. This individualistic notion of faith may be related to the emergent consumerist sensibility where people are making choices between available religious repertoire by constructing moral reasonings for their choices. Shielke has noted that even in times of exceptional piety, such as Ramadan, Egyptian youth are torn between various frames of action, such as consumerism, neoliberalism, and piety. Their subjectivities are fraught through ambivalence and confusion over choosing between religious and social norms as the most appropriate form of social action in a given context. The idea of a complex social context and individuality as the necessary starting point for understanding Islam has already been acknowledged. Mazen Hashim observes that contemporary Muslim activism cannot be understood without taking into the confluence of global, local, and individualistic tendencies and pressures. To cite an example from Kerala, one of the interlocutors in Tahir's article proclaims that, I quote, numerous Quranic injunctions give ample sources for the environmental conservation, unquote. The environmental conservation and climate justice movements are a recent phenomenon. They did not exist few decades back, or rather, they did not attract such broader and global attention as it has assumed in recent times. Such contemporary examples emphasize the point that Muslims, like all religious communities, are living complex religious subjectivities today where they are inserted into various regimes of conflicting values and modalities of action. Yet they try to engage with them, make sense of them, and challenge them using terms and categories drawn from their own religious traditions. I suggest that the idea of the lived tradition enables us to understand such complexities. By lived tradition, I combine both the discursive tradition as well as how Muslims engage with and employ Islam to order and make sense of their everyday life. As I have already noted, I borrow the term lived from the conceptualization of lived religion proposed by scholars like Meredith McGuire and Nancy Ammerman. I take the idea of tradition from Asad's conceptualization of discursive tradition. I believe that our theoretical language and toolkit will be enriched if we understand Islam as a lived tradition. My point is that in understanding Muslim lives today, we need to attend to the complexities of their social context rather than reducing it simply as a background frame where Islamic practices are being played out. It is useful to turn to Shahab Ahmad's idea of context, where he uses the con and then hyphen text with a capital T. So that's what I mean by context. So wherever this term context occurs, this is Shahab Ahmad. He argues that in conceiving Islam as a historical and human phenomenon, we cannot be limited by an understanding of Islam as a discursive tradition as proposed by Talal Asad, which emphasizes established practice and establishing authority and power as the domain of understanding Islam. My point is that the context, the Shahab Ahmad's idea of context, should also be complemented by the idea of a social context in which interpretations and engagements of Islam develop. The social context throws up a range of normative schemas originating from various social spheres, and Muslims often engage with them using a context. This does not mean that all aspects of their lives will be punctuated by normative aspects of Islam. Rather, even while engaging in seemingly non-Islamic practices, Islam can be called upon to justify, negotiate, challenge, and discard practices. Islam, so this is the kind of, a little more. Islam cannot simply be looked upon as the overarching framework to understand Muslim subjectivity or even as a single one. Rather, we need to attend to the other part of it, the contemporary moment, a moment that is increasingly being defined by non-religious frames such as the market, state, and ideas of individual autonomy and freedom. Drawing upon the idea of practicing suggested by Courtney Bender, I find values as a useful analytical entry to understand Muslim everyday life. The realm of values is not homogeneous, and Islam is not the only frame that is providing a strong motivational setup for the actors. To illustrate this point, I would like to give you an example. If you look at Muslim engagements with the banking system in Kerala, you can see a range of responses. Among religious scholars themselves, you will see a spectrum at the end of which you can still see people refusing to operate a bank account, and at the middle ground, you will see religious scholars saying that you cannot avoid the bank nowadays. And at the same time, we should be wary of interest. And they devise various methods to engage with this interest. At the other end of the spectrum, you can see religious scholars saying that it is a necessary evil and Allah will forgive us. You can observe more nuanced and complex positions within the spectrum as well. I gave the example about religious scholars because one should not think that this kind of a fluidity is observable only at the popular realm. The whole point is that in understanding how Islam operates here, we need to have a complex understanding of the concept. At the center of this discussion on banking lies the idea of interest, which is deemed haram in Islam. Yet, Muslims seem to be engaging with this domain in varied ways, often embracing the practice. How do we think about this? I point that what remains at the center of the lived tradition is what I call practical adherence. It should be understood as a modality of action whereby Muslims are employing varied frames of action available in Islam to formulate a course of life today. On the one hand, Muslims want things to work and live without many problems in the contemporary world. At the same time, this practical adherence is colored by the agony to orient towards Allah and to define one's piety in contemporary moment. So, the everyday should not be understood as a domain that challenges and destabilizes the normative. It is often portrayed as the space where individual Muslims sometimes unsuccessfully try to embody the normative tenets of Islam. We should rather understand it as the quintessential domain in which normative is negotiated in varying ways. Here, The idea of the normative should not be understood within the strictures of doctrinal uniformity and adherence. What in fact matters in the domain of the everyday is a varied set of acting available within the repertoire of Islam, which is motivated by the idea of practical adherence. To return to the question of caste with which I began, we cannot understand its persistence and working without paying attention to the political economy of the Malabar region in South India. It has been used for a long time. Sorry. So my idea is that even to understand caste as a category, you need to understand the social context. So it has been based, so the kind of political economy of the region, Malabar, has been based for a long time on the patronage system, which persisted in full force in some domains of activities such as barbering till the 1970s. Within the patronage system, there were two individualities possible, that of the patron and the client. The relationships between the patron and the client were structured on interdependence and hierarchy, whereby the barbers were supposed to provide their services for rewards in kind. While this hierarchical structure seemed antithetical to the egalitarian spirit of Islam, Muslims usually rationalized the hierarchical arrangements as a willful arrangement of work and a division of labor existing in any society. At the same time, they also added that since barbers worked with undesirable objects such as blood, dirt, and sweat, they were inferior and sometimes incapable to occupy an Islamic subjectivity. In other words, they could not fully embody the pious subjectivity of a Muslim. I'm just concluding. While acting as Muslims, they were also implicated in various registers of action where status, prestige, and moral worth were important categories. Some of them were viewed as shaped by Islamic ideas as well. In the case of social hierarchy, being born into a particular social group ensured your social worth as well as the status and prestige one can achieve in society. Such values were often mediated by ideas from Islam. For instance, other Muslim social groups did not usually encourage marriage alliances with barbers, citing that potential partners will not have kufr. This idea is rooted in the jurisprudential discourses that since barbers have been dealing with undesirable stuff, including najas, they will not be suitable for marriage alliances with social groups having higher status. In caste, as a way to organize and make sense of social divisions among themselves, among Muslims, they employed ideas from Islam, division of labor, conversion, status, prestige, and even the governing categories of the state. While all these propensities of action existed, the external reference in all these contexts were somehow Islam, where it remains as an ultimate referent to make sense of one's subjectivity and social context. That's what I mean by practical adherence. Thank you.